lecture number 10, April 26, 1958.
This lecture began with the reading of quotation number 6 from By Love Possessed by James Gould Cousins.
In Recollections light, first to be noted was the plain fact that by standards of what was later learned, the feelings affording a young man his state of love, of being in love, were largely factious. This was not by any means to say that they are false or pretended, but still they had not, as the young man himself was likely to imagine, arisen spontaneously. In theory, the feelings resulted when love magically and mysteriously seized on him. In theory, that was what love did. In practice, love did nothing of the kind. He, the truth usually was, seized on love. A young man heard and read of a thing called love. Love was praised everywhere as pure, noble, and beautiful. Love did have to do with the commerce between the sexes, but love as described clearly could not have to do with sex. The physical urges of nature that he knew about, those had been denounced to him as evil and impure. The associates of what he joined in calling, even if he fairly frequently indulged in them, dirty jokes, dirty thoughts, dirty practices. What those were must be everything true love wasn't. Love knew them not. Love manifestly was out of this world. Love's high feelings, at once so exciting and so presentable, could moreover be had apparently by anyone. A young man would not be long in resolving to have some. To the rules of high-mindedness, the flesh is imperfectly amenable. Kisses, however chaste, caresses, however decent, if the exchange of them is kept up, must have the flesh soon shaping to its natural end, projecting its actual objective. A discipline of mind was required. The witching hour was to be saved intact by a division of consciousness, one part excluding rigidly all that engaged the other part. Held separate, thoughts on the plane of moonlight and roses could proceed regardless of the lower animal, or at least they could so proceed to a point. Due to that blameless neglect of hopes, to call a halt, she, the fair, the chaste, the inexpressive she, had no need to call. And to her partner in petting's reluctance to leave since he was free to remain, there had been awkward occasions when the animal, disregarded by the hour and teased too far, reacted of a sudden, put to the shilly-shally so long imposed its own unpreventable end. Arthur Winner, Jr., confusion in the moonlight, dismay among the roses, was obliged to conceal as well as he could a crisis about which his single shamed consolation was that hope, anything but knowing, would never know what had happened.
Now, who cares to express an opinion? Does it mean I discouraged everybody? All right, if no one cares, I'll start. I assume you all see the difference between that and all the other quotations that we read. Now, here you have an example of pure naturalism. And the word pure in this context is somewhat inappropriate, but this is real realism or naturalism. The first thing I would like you to observe is whether this is impartial, unselective, unvaluing recording. Now, you can obviously see that it is not. It is very slanted writing. The author's values or his value judgment are obvious, and yet this is what is supposed to be or intended to be a naturalistic recording of things as they are. Observe all the slanted writing. For instance, he is describing as an objective fact of nature, or as a factor in the lives of all men, the kind of attitude that the hero had towards love. Observe that he doesn't say this was the situation of this particular young man. No, he describes it in generalized terms as if all young men at first fall in love only because they have heard about it, and in fact they feel nothing, but they are what we call social metaphysicians. That is, people who tell themselves that they feel something just because they know that other people feel it. It's a kind of a glorified Peter Keating view of human beings, glorified downward, because Peter Keating is a much higher human being than this. But what is implied here is that the psychology of all men, observe this, not just of the hero, but of all young men, is 10 times worse than the worse that I presented in the character of Peter Keating. That is, that all young men are impressed and feel emotions only according to how other people feel them or say they feel them. Observe that he states, a young man heard and read of a thing called love. Love was praised everywhere as pure, noble, and beautiful. Now that is, of course, the motivation of every young man, according to the author. Since it's praised everywhere, the young man will accept the praise. And then further, love has nothing to do with sex. The physical urges that were supposed to be evil and impure. Again, observe, there is a very, to say the least, debatable, in fact, very false and awful view of sex, the Christian mystical view, and yet the author presents it here as if this were a general fact, as if it's a fact of human nature and an estimate not to be doubted. He doesn't consider it an estimate. He writes of it as if this is just a fact. And then he proceeds to say that love's high feelings, at once so exciting and so presentable, and I want particularly to note the word presentable, meaning respectable, meaning that love was approved of while sex wasn't, and that therefore his hero wants to experience love. But observe the kind of ghastly, philosophical value judgment presented as if it were a fact of reality. Now, what kind of value judgment is presented here? The conventional, the statistical average. That is, what conventionally would be the view of a certain class of people, the class which I suppose the author takes to be the majority average. The author takes them as a fact of human nature and presents it as such. He does not state that these were the views of his hero, nor of the hero's particular social group. He states these views as if they were facts. And yet, he's talking about views, that is, a certain kind of philosophical viewpoint. He doesn't identify it as such, since this is the way most people, or he thinks that which is most people, feel. If these are their feelings, they are to be presented as objective facts. Now, observe the kind of value judgment this represents. You understand that when I say value judgment, that means a code of values, whether a man admits it as such or not, whether he identifies it or not. Now, as you can observe, this is the most vicious of all possible code of values. Observe the mind and body split, the sex versus love, the social influences, man being a helpless animal, sex belonging to his lower animal nature, his high feelings being just a silly romantic illusion. What it all comes down to is a stupid physical urge. All of these judgments goes through the whole writing of this passage. What would make anyone classify this as naturalistic? Only the fact that the picture of man that comes through it is a very revolting one. So long as you do not present anything heroic or valuable, today's naturalism will take it as a true picture of reality. What would make people accept this as real is the fact that here man is being sneered at. Man is presented as depraved in as horrible a way as anyone can do it and still remain within the limits of an allegedly serious literature. I must add that that is not, of course, a basic principle of naturalism. Naturalism as a school started out a much more respectable level. But this, I think, is the bottom level of naturalism. When you go beyond it, when you go into the kind of modern stories of dipsomaniacs and all kinds of perverts, that really is outside the bounds of literature. So I think this particular book is a very good example of the lowest rung of naturalism, beyond which you go into preposterous pornography. This book is pornographic too, but I mean in its approach to men, in its approach to what it purports to regard as man's nature, this is as low as you can go in respectable naturalistic literature, and I question my own estimate as respectable, but all right, let's stretch it and let's assume that this is. I wonder how many of you have caught the extremely revolting overall style of the whole passage. Apart from anything that the author specifically states, there is something extremely repulsive about the way it's stated. And it's here that I want you to observe the two elements that I told you in the first lecture on style constitute the essence of style. That is the content, that which the author chooses to say, and the way he says it, the use of words. Not only are the things he chooses to say about men and love horrible, not only does he select in the thoughts he presents, in the content, the most offensive things possible, but observe the manner in which he says them. It will be awfully hard to put your finger on what particular line, it's every line and all of them, that give you that impression of a sneer. If you were to identify what is the essence of this particular style, in one word, sneer is the word that I see. It's a sneering attitude at the subject under discussion, certainly at love and at man as such. Now observe the details of how it's done. Now here's one interesting touch, for instance, where the author says that theory and practice do not coincide. Observe this. In theory, the feelings resulted when love magically and mysteriously seized on him. In theory, that was what love did. In practice, love did nothing of the kind. This, incidentally, quite apart from literature, and to just make a philosophical aside for a moment, is a very good example of the manner in which all alleged oppositions between theory and practice are presented. Because all you have to do to refute him is ask in whose theory. Observe, he says that in theory the feelings resulted when love came magically out of nowhere, and in practice it wasn't so. Well, now, whose theory said that it was so? And if you do see this kind of paradox or contradiction in reality, then shouldn't you question the theory? Or question your interpretation of the practice? But it's not what the author does. He simply takes some kind of theory, the most bromidic, the most striking, the most superficial of all theories, the one that love comes blindly and spontaneously out of nowhere and for no reason. He takes that as a valid theory. He then proceeds to say that it isn't so in practice, and of course, what is the conclusion of it? That man is unable to think, because by theory here is meant reason or thought, some kind of theoretical conclusion that men have reached about love, which reality and practice then proceed to upset. The sole purpose of this particular opposition, and of every opposition of that kind, is to show you how helpless man's mind is to deal with his own emotions or with reality. He supposed one thing about love, and in reality found that it was something else. The question then is, if he supposed the kind of fool nonsense which is presented here is the fault in man's mind being unable to think, or in this particular man's foolishness. But that is not what the author implies, and that's not what any opposition of theory and practice implies. Whenever you hear that theory and practice do not coincide, and that man is unable to form any proper theories, any valid theories, which means is unable to think, anytime you hear that presented, you will see that the theory, which is then being refuted, is a straw man. A foolish or illogical theory is first set up, and then the author triumphantly shows you that it doesn't work in practice, and of course the conclusion is man's mind is not valid or impotent. Now the mere intention of the author here in opposing that kind of theory with the kind of practice he describes is of course the undercutting of the mind and the degradation of man. Then observe the next stretches. Social metaphysics I've mentioned. That is the fact that his hero is totally moved by what other people do or feel or think. His whole motivation is presented as something borrowed from the statements or the actions of other people. Stylistically, observe the deliberate repetitions, the unnecessary repetitions, which here are not accidental, nor are they as innocent as the repetitions that we observed in Thomas Wolfe's style. You remember from last session, when we analyzed Thomas Wolfe's writing, we noted a lot of repetitions, but the reason there was more poetic, or in some cases rhythmical considerations, where he repeated things just for the rhythm of a sentence. But observe that here, in this man's style, there are repetitions, but they are there for a totally different purpose. Right in the beginning, when you have the sentence, the feelings affording a young man his state of love, of being in love, were largely fictitious. Now, is there any earthly purpose in that repetition? His state of love, of being in love. Has anything been added? No. But what has been added? Awkwardness. Deliberately planned awkwardness. The implication here was first to insult the state of love. When the author uses the word his state of love, that is more or less a serious or formal definition of what he's talking about. And then he adds the colloquial one of being in love. The second is redundant in regard to the first, but what is the change? Is the first the general or abstract statement, and then the colloquialism. What for? Just to have a little sneer at the side, and just to remind the reader, now in case you're so stupid that you don't know what the state of love is, I am making fun of that state which you will recognize better if I tell you that it's being in love, because that is the way most people would think of it. That is what colloquially conveys much more the emotion of a young romance. That's the first of this kind of repetition. Now, look at the next one. In theory, the feelings resulted when love magically and mysteriously seized on him. In theory, that was what love did. Now, why is that repetition? It said it already in the first sentence. What's the purpose of the second one? Again, nothing but the implied stupidity of the reader. It's someone saying with a nasty smile, in theory, love does such and such. In theory, that's what love does. Remember, you arrested development students. You can't get a thought the first time. I'll just tell it to you with a patronizing sneer a second time. There is no other implication in this kind of repetition. Now, observe the next particular trait, vulgarity, deliberate vulgarity. On the one hand, a very stodgy, almost archaic, dignified mid-Victorian style of writing, not actually mid-Victorian, but a satire on the 19th century mid-Victorian novel, where the author has long, involved, and awkward sentences. And in the middle of it, deliberately vulgar bromides. By vulgar, I mean vulgar literarily, such as Moonlight in Roses, or The Lower Animal, or Love Was Out of This World. Now, out of this world is a gutter expression, in the sense that it's not literary, it's not even good slang. What is the purpose of its inclusion here? Deliberately, again, like about the state of being in love, to remind the reader that I, the author, am now condescending to speak your language. I, the author, of course, is very academic and very stately old gentleman. I'm speaking now for the author of this kind of style. But I occasionally will condescend to use your language, which would be Moonlight in Roses and Out of This World. You see, it's the deliberate use of ugly bromides, of inexpressive bromides, in the middle of the deliberate stodginess and awkwardness of the archaic style. That is what makes the whole writing so unattractive. But the purpose of this kind of combination is the philosophical contempt for men. That is the way by which the metaphysical sneer is conveyed. Any reader reading this will feel uncomfortable if he's a sensitive reader at all. And the reason for it will be that the insult to the intelligence of whoever is reading it is built into the sentences. It's right in the choice, not only of what the author says, but also of the way he says it. It is deliberately patronizing, deliberately repetitious, and deliberately slangy once in a while, in the colloquial way, as if to imply that you, the reader, will not understand such words as manifestly or standards or state of love or commerce between the sexes, all that very ponderous form of talking. Of course you wouldn't understand that, so the author will come down once in a while and let his head down with the kind of vulgarity which he assumes you will understand. Rather, that is the kind of picture of a reader that he projects. Now, of course, you will all find it very hard to read. It's a style that you cannot really grasp at the first reading, not because it's so subtle or profound, but because it's so terribly involved grammatically. Again, deliberately involved. Observe in a second part, for instance. Or at least they could so proceed to a point, due to that blameless neglect of hopes to call the whole she, parenthesis, the fair, the chaste, the inexpressive she, exclamation point, close parenthesis, had no need to call. Now, I submit that anyone could possibly ever have any need to write that way, unless it's deliberate. And therefore, you can say that this is very high art, if you want to call it art. If by art we mean someone purposefully carrying out an intention, then this is very high art. What we can quarrel with is the intention. The intention here is the deliberate destruction of your epistemology. If one of the cardinal purpose of good writing, rules of good writing, should be clarity, if the purpose of communication should be to communicate as clearly and as easily as possible, here the exact opposite is done. Not only by the content of what he chooses to say, but more specifically by the way he puts words together, by his grammatical structures. He deliberately makes it impossible for you to follow a consistent thought in any kind of order. What he seems intent on doing is to make you a bad backseat driver, epistemologically. That is almost institutionalized backseat driving. You remember driving is an associational, non-purposeful way of thinking. Well, here he deliberately goes into asides which he does not bother to construct into sentences, precisely to not to allow your mind to proceed to one completed thought. He'll deliberately throw you off for a moment and then continue the thought. For instance, in this sentence in which he uses parentheses, due to that blameless neglect of folks to call the hoe, she had no need to call. That is the thought he is expressing. But in the meantime, he has to remind you that she was fair, chaste, and inexpressive. Now, I was speaking about the sentence interrupted by a parenthesis. Now, the proper thought here, or the first part of the thought, ends at that first semicolon. The neglect of hope to call the hoe, she had no need to call. That is the thought the author is expressing. In parentheses, he then puts a reminder of what the character of hope was like. In proper epistemology, that is, if a mind has to proceed to a certain thought in a logical order, the author, if this is the thought he wanted to convey, would have had to phrase the sentence differently. He would have had to leave the reader grammatical time to remember the character of hope. That's what he wanted. Then say what it was that hope failed to do. I mean, this would be the logical order. But the author deliberately proceeds on a certain thought, interrupts it at the most awkward point, that is she, and then head. Between the subject and the verb, this long insert. From whom? Is this in the mind of the characters? No, it's an aside in narrative. It's an aside from the author. Put there for what purpose? To distract your mind off the sentence you're reading. So that you have to go into some sudden backseat driving aside and then bring yourself back to the purpose of the sentence at the most difficult time possible. I mean, difficult in the grammatical sense. The mere awkwardness of that inserted parenthesis indicates that the awkwardness was intended. Then, you have similar kind of repetition in the second part of the sentence. There had been awkward occasions when the animal, parenthesis, disregarded by the hour and teased too far, reacted of a sudden. Now, again, properly speaking, she could have very well said there had been awkward occasions when the animal had been disregarded by the hour and teased too far and reacted of a sudden, or something like that. I don't mean to supply the word, but I mean the progression of the thought had to go in a certain kind of time sequence to give the reader a logical grasp of what the author is talking about. That's not what he did. Again, he interrupts in the middle of a thought to throw you into an aside and then let you, in effect, mentally scramble to catch the original intention. That's deliberate confusion and deliberate putting the mind into a non-rational state of wandering all over the map. That is, if the reader follows the author's intention, which one has to when one reads. To the extent to which the reader goes with that style, he has to be put in an unfocused, epistemologically destructive method.
At this point, one of the students asked Miss Rand to comment on the second part of that sentence. saying that he could not decide whether it had any meaning at all.
I can only compliment you for not understanding what the meaning is. Yeah, I can translate it. You have to grasp his meaning from the beginning of that paragraph, which is another indication of the deliberately confusing and, in fact, very obscene style. And when I say obscene, I mean it on two counts, both the content of what he specifically talks about here and the obscenity of doing this to a reader's consciousness. You have to watch very carefully for the between the lines implications to know what he's really talking about in this paragraph. And this kind of indirection, writing by this kind of implication, is another distinction of Mr. Cousin's style. Do you note the kind of Victorian precedence, which consists of whenever you talk about sex or any kind of subject on that order, to be very bashfully indirect. And the more indirect you are, the dirtier the implications of what you don't dare say openly. If you've ever seen censored novels or Victorian novels of the most inhibited period, you'll know that indirection sometimes sounds much dirtier than anything you could say openly. Well, that's the style he's imitating here. In plain words, what he's talking about is again an illustration of his theory of love in the first part of the quotation. That is, that even though the young man had decided that real love was to be platonic, in effect until marriage, I suppose, and that it had nothing to do with sex, which he considered dirty. Well, the author here says that even if the young couple tried to keep it chaste, things would happen against the young man's will. And he doesn't mean normal intercourse. Read that sentence and you'll see what I mean. Or do you want me to explain it any clearer than that? Or is there anyone who doesn't understand what the meaning of that second sentence is?
There are 2 points in particular. There's no need to call as about Parker and Petting's reluctance to leave. I see. Parker and Petting's reluctance to leave, since Petting is free from them?
Yes. Oh. And since she was chaste, you see, and she did not experience anything, or she was not physically aroused, she didn't stop him when he proceeded to pet, whichever the author means by petting, incidentally, another use of a slang expression that's very vulgar. Since she did not stop him, he stayed too long, and then it had certain physical consequences on him.
But since he was featuring man, you say he refers to the young man.
Yeah.
But why couldn't he refer to Petting? Petting doesn't believe since he was featuring man.
Well, because Petting would be it, not he. But I mean, grammatically, you're right. It could be. It all hangs on just one pronoun. A structure, yes.
And
one second.
There's one more thing that made it incomprehensible. The animal reacted or something put to the shilly-shally. Now, what is put to the shilly-shally?
Now, that is a very good question. That's an example of his kind of grammar. Put to the shilly-shally so long imposed. Its own unpreventable end. The grammatical meaning is that the animal put its own unpreventable end to the shilly-shally which had been imposed on it, the animal, too long. That's what I say. That's the best comment. I think Bob Heston was next.
Well, on this, I think shilly-shally means delay. He says put its own end, put an end to the unpreventable long-imposed delay.
That's right.
Even then,
no, put an unpreventable end to the delay which had been imposed for so long.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, I read it thus that the animal was put to the shilly-shally so long, and the animal imposed its unpreventable end.
It could it could be read that way. No, that wouldn't quite have been it, but observe the mere fact that we have to do this is the best criticism of the author's intention. I mean, that is the answer to this kind of style. There is no reason why anyone has to sit and read a sentence 3 different ways before deciding which way did the author mean it. No, wait, not everyone's one.
I just wanted to say that I think confusion about the first sentence rested on what was the subject of the verb. Well, no, it isn't really a verb. But anyway, the person who has the reluctance to leave is her partner in heaven. In heaven. The reluctance to leave belongs to her partner in heaven. It is not petting reluctance to leave.
It's her partner's in petting,
Partner's reluctance.
which is also very bad grammar. He makes one noun out of partner in petting and puts the possessive to that, but how his copy editor permitted it, I don't know.
I don't see how you could get there.
Huh? I suppose so.
I still can't see it. I can't see it your way yet.
Oh.
Legitimately, I can't see it any other way than it's being petty reluctance to leave. It's triangle, grammatically.
Grammatically, yes. Yes. But it's her partner in petting is made a noun.
Yeah.
And then the S apostrophe belongs to that.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Supposing you put hyphens. If you put hyphens after partner and after in, then you would make one noun out of it, which is as inexcusably unnecessary construction as you can imagine. But that's again, that is one of the proofs that the author's confusedness is intentional. It isn't bad writing in the sense that he couldn't do any better. This is good writing by his standard, in the sense that that is what he intended. This is intentional involvement and probably took very difficult work, because no one can do that naturally, but observe the kind of intention that is achieved. Now, is the meaning clear? Incidentally, let me apologize for selecting that kind of obscenity, but I looked at some of the other passages, and for those of you who have read the book will know that this is very polite. The rest is so much worse that there's no comparison. And the style of this, the mere fact that he's not talking about actually an affair, but something much pettier and totally unnecessary to mention, that is what makes this passage so typical. He had to go out of his way to make something ugly, which in fact is not ugly at all, not necessarily, but observe the way he presents it. And throughout the whole book, incidentally, there are passage after passage where he deliberately selects some physiological function or something about men which may not be ugly at all, except in the way the author presents it. He presents it in the spiritual style of 4-letter words. Now you know that 4-letter words all have non-obscene synonyms, that you can say the same things in academic or polite language. But what's the nature of the language of obscenity, of 4-letter words? It's a slanted value language to begin with. Value in the sense of a judgment passed. All 4-letter words are obscene, not so much by their content, but by their intention. That is, they are supposed to stand for a degradation of the kind of functions or anatomical facts to which they refer. It's a value language to begin with, believe it or not. If we, by value here, we mean a chosen estimate, apart from the fact whether it's correct value or obscene value. And the author's approach here, in style, is the same as the style of all swear words, of all obscenities in any language, where certain combination of sounds or certain words are made obscene, not so much by what they refer to, but by the intention. The intention being to convey that that which is referred to is obscene or evil or improper. The whole approach of the author through these two selections, the whole subject of love and sex, is written in that kind of style. In a style which, by its selection of terms and of emphasis, wants to convey to you that that which is being talked about is dirty, petty, and shameful. Smutty, in fact, is the word. And he succeeded admirably.
I just wanted to mention the fact that there seems to me to be another very strong effect created by this particular style. And that is that it creates an enormous feeling of distance between the author and his characters. So that you are constantly aware of the author observing his characters, and thus by implication reserving sort of attitude of dispassion for himself, which actually is not so. In other words, attempting to attribute a dispassionate point of view to himself through this style, which is almost like looking at people through the wrong end of the telescope in its effect.
That is true. You mean observing what kind of miserable little ants they are.
That's right. The style itself creates this distance in that you never simply notice what the characters are doing. You notice the author noticing them.
That's right. And it's highly slanted because the author is constantly commenting. But he's commenting from what viewpoint? Just the one you say, that he's somewhere in space, in outer space, above all this, and he's pronouncing judgment. What kind of judgment? Oh, he's not supposed to pronounce judgment. He's merely recording facts. But he himself is present throughout, and yet totally above it. It's that he wants you to think he's above it. The question always to ask yourself in such cases is, who is speaking? In the sense of by what standard? Because the standard of the speaker, of any author, is apparent in his work. And the most revealed character, the best characterization in anyone's writing, is the author himself, if you know how to look for the signs. Now, we've observed that in the 6 different passages that we've covered so far, you can see even from one selected passage the different personalities and the whole philosophy of the 6 authors we've covered. And in that sense, no author can hide himself in a novel. I've always said that the fiction writer really stands naked spiritually, if you know what to look for. And from these discussions, have you observed by what signs an author betrays his actual values, his philosophy, his sense of life, his metaphysics? Do you see that? And it's particularly clear here. You're right, the author's intention here, just so you don't accept it, I hope, is that he stands as some kind of Olympian, detached somewhere, not on this earth, and looks through the wrong end of a telescope, and I would borrow your metaphor and add something, a very dirty lens. And he looks and sees these worms and damns all mankind, whereas he should check his own glasses. Now, so much for this particular quotation. Now, before we proceed, anyone who wants to comment, either question or anything that we haven't covered, we can do it now before we proceed to the next quotation. This concludes the 6 selections which were all on the subject of love. The next one will go to descriptions. Bob?
I'd like to clear up the meaning of what does it mean? Through that blameless neglect approach to call the home, he had no need to call.
Well, that I suppose would have to be it's made clear in the actual context. I'm not sure it's fully clear here. In the preceding paragraphs, he described the fact that she was apparently frigid, that she didn't experience anything physical from embraces or kisses. Therefore, her blameless neglect to call the hold, she had no need to call. In other words, she could go on kissing or petting, and she would experience nothing. Therefore, she, being chaste, had no need to tell him to stop. Again, ask yourself, what kind of moral code is speaking here? Yet it's described as a fact. I mean, how many questions one could raise about that? Why, if she's if she felt anything, why should she ask him to stop? Or if she did or didn't, should they stop or shouldn't they? And the questions here, there are more questions than words in that sentence. Yet this is presented as dispassionate reporting, non-slanted and non-value oriented. Jim?
You need a more primary question, so nothing questions she begins.
I think it's implied in the earlier passages, not too clearly, that she also, being a social metaphysician, in effect, wanted a husband because everybody had a husband. So she submitted. She's described somewhat like Lillian in Atlas Shrugged only, not as philosophically, that she's totally frigid, and she complies with the young man's or later her husband's lower animal nature. She has no interest in it except duty. Anyone else? I would suggest that you don't analyze the content of this too much, but stylistically, have we covered anything, or have you any questions or any other observations to make? Or is this eloquent enough? I guess it is. Now, I want to ask you two questions in conclusion of this whole group of 6 quotations about love. The first one is it clear to you now, without going into further detail, by what signs, or by what means one can gather the author's philosophy in passages which have nothing to do with philosophy directly? Is it clear to you how one can read, by implication, by the style, the nature of the author's approach to life? I could not, of course, spend too much time on this, but I wanted to give you just the indication of the method, and I think we've covered it sufficiently. And you have enough variety of different authors here to see by what signs you can judge the philosophy. Now, for practical purposes, for those of you who want to be future writers, I want to call your attention to the fact that you could not possibly start expressing or composing a style as apart from your basic philosophy. You see, just by the analysis of these 6 quotations, why it's impossible to compose a style artificially. You would have no way of weighing every word, quite apart from the fact that it would take an incredibly long time, if it could be done at all, if you were to compose each sentence word by word and then weigh each particular word of how does it fit with my official dogma. That is, those of you who might be slightly dogmatic about our philosophy in the sense of not having integrated or accepted it fully firsthand, to the extent to which some of our philosophy is still in the state of semi-floating abstractions for you, it's from that aspect in particular that if you started now to write and to weigh every sentence in relation to a floating abstraction, which would then be dogma in your mind, you could not possibly do it. And you could not start writing and then wonder, is this in line with my philosophy or not? Do you see the sense in which, in all the 6 quotations, the author's philosophy was present, but the author could not possibly do it consciously? It was present in the selection of what the author chose to say and in the epistemology of the manner in which he said it, in the choice of words. This comes from an accepted philosophy, that is accepted in your subconscious, whether consciously or not. If it's your conscious philosophy, and you know what it is, and it's sunk into your subconscious so that it comes to you naturally, automatically, so that you don't have to question it any longer, then your style will reflect your philosophy. If your philosophy is not fully assimilated, if it's part conscious, and you might have other unidentified or contradictory premises in your subconscious, that will come out in the style. Then, for the purposes of writing, quite apart from your general philosophical education, but for the purposes of writing in particular, you can see from these selections to what an extent a philosophy affects the style. and why you need to have a consistent philosophy as writers, let alone as human beings. And in the same way as in your general behavior as human beings, your premises will out. They will out in so many subtle ways. Or any conflict you might have will show, particularly in emergencies or in an unusual situation. The same thing is true of writing. You cannot be any better as a writer than the kind of premises you have set for yourself, and your premises will out. If you have a conflict of premises, that will show in contradictions and conflicts in your writing. If you have good premises, that will show. If you have god-awful premises, you have just seen an example of it. Whichever is in your subconscious, your style will show it. And the question is only if you're not satisfied with what comes out of your subconscious, then you know psychologically how to correct it. The method of correction is by conscious front seat driving thinking. If you see that you have contradictions by the result of what you write, then think over your premises, analyze them until you are convinced one way or the other. But, as I said before, do not center yourself in the process of writing. It cannot be done. Whichever you have, good, bad, or mixed, will show in your style. And I want you particularly to notice in this sixth selection how it works. And that in order to be the kind of writer you consciously want to be, first and foremost, be the kind of thinker you want to be. This is an example of man is a being of self-made soul, and a writer is a being of self-made soul and of self-made style. And both are made by the same process, but it can be done by conscious front seat effort. It has to be done by subconscious integration, by being fully sold on certain premises to the point where they become unconscious and automatic. Now, from the sixth selection that you have, is it clear to you what the two aspects of style consist of that I started by naming? The content of what you want to say and the way in which you use words. I deliberately selected passages on approximately the same theme, that is love, particularly to show you what I meant by the selection of content. In all the six selections we've covered, the assignment of the author was to present love. They would all be somewhat different plot circumstances, but the essence is the same. Now then, what is significant is what did the six authors choose to say, and that's what I mean by the content of selection. What kind of ideas or touches or descriptions they chose to include, and then the manner, the use of words, the grammatical style by which they chose to convey the content. Now those are the two main elements which make up style. Now, I think we better cover the next two as quickly as possible because they're brief, and then we'll make the break. Now let's go to number 7. The next two deal with just general descriptions of nature. And after the break, we'll take up the ones that deal with the description of New York. The reason for my selection, as I think I had explained, I was trying to find the kind of description that would deal approximately with the same subject, because that would bring out the difference of approach better. So let's take the next two, which are descriptions of nature. Then number 7, please. That is from Atlas Shrugged.
She sat at the window of the train, her head thrown back, not moving, wishing she would never have to move again. The telegraph poles went racing past the window, but the train seemed lost in a void, between a brown stretch of prairie and a solid spread of rusty graying clouds. The twilight was draining the sky without the wound of a sunset. It looked more like the fading of an anemic body in the process of exhausting its last drops of blood and light. The train was going west, as if it too were pulled to follow the sinking rays and quietly to vanish from the earth. She sat still, feeling no desire to resist it.
All right, who wants to come in? Just one. if anyone wants to just name the essence, what is the stylistic principle here? Anyone? No? All right. Now, what I wanted to illustrate here is a subject on which we touched briefly last time, the art of denotation and connotation. This is, to begin with, a description. Observe the method which I use. Now, my assignment here was to describe a certain view of nature, a sunset seen from the window of a train, and a certain kind of mood. The method I followed is this. First, observe that I give you very precise information about the nature of the site. But as in everything I've said about the romantic method, I give it to you by means of those details which are essential and which convey the essence of the scene described. I don't give you every detail of the scene, but I give you those details which will give you the overall picture. What did I have to describe? The fact that it's a brown stretch of prairie at a sunset. And the kind of dismal, hopeless sunset which would match the mood of Dagny in this scene, and in fact the mood of the whole country. Then observe the method by which I'm doing it. Everything that I describe is described specifically. I mean, you know exactly what kind of scene it is, in essential. But by the kind of words I select, and by the kind of metaphor, I convey the mood. Now, I do not convey the mood in the manner that Thomas Wolfe tried to do. That is, the mood apart from that which has created the mood. I do both here. I tell you exactly the kind of scene, and in the manner I describe it, I convey the estimate. That is the emotional mood which would be experienced by the girl in the scene and by the reader. The method of doing it is, of course, a very careful selection of words which would convey the exact particular physical details and that will have very specific connotations. For instance, you see, if I have a solid spread of rusty grain clouds, and the mere word rusty would not only convey the color, but also something very dismal, not very cheerful. The word twilight is something that immediately has connotations of sadness and a down, negative mood. And of course, the best part of the description is the twilight was draining the sky without the wound of a sunset. Now, by connoting it visually, first the visual metaphor is legitimate. There is a sunset would look like a wound across the sky. Therefore, the metaphor is visually appropriate. It will help you to visualize what a sunset looks like. But then I convey the exact description and the mood by means of a negative, by saying that the sky was being drained without the wound of a sunset. And I continue the metaphor in exactly the same style. That is, it looked more like the fading of an anemic body in the process of exhausting its last drops of blood and life. Now, first I convey that there was no wound, and then I said it's an anemic body that is exhausting its last drops of blood. And when I say and light, I bring the metaphor back to the actual concrete, to the reality of the sunset and the evening. And in the last sentence, I was consciously selecting words that would all have that downbeat, negative twilight feeling. The train was going west as if it too were pulled to follow the sinking rays and quietly to vanish from the earth. She said, still feeling no desire to resist it. You see, when you say something is going west, it immediately connotes the sunset and evening. And it's being pulled. It isn't really even going of its own power. Where is it pulled? To follow the sinking rays and quietly to vanish. And again, observe the intentional double meaning. First, it's the literal description that the train is going towards the west. And then when I say quietly to vanish from the earth, I imply much more than merely vanish into the sunset. I imply all the connotations of destruction and hopelessness, and the feeling of your days are numbered, which is sort of the emotional key for the whole of this chapter, which this description opens. Now, that is the method used here. Any questions? Or yes?
It puzzles me that this is considered the description of nature, because it seems to me to be so strongly the description of a mood of a person, as seen through her reactions to a particular view, that I would not tend to consider it a description of nature at all. My focus is completely imputing this on the person who is watching this. And it seems to me that all of the description and the metaphors are applicable mainly to her mood.
No, because do you have any idea of what the description of that sunset is? I mean, do you have any idea apart from her of what did the evening look like? I've indicated.
Yes, I do. I don't mean that I don't. But I guess that perhaps I should ask a question here, and that is it part of the romantic method to see nature mainly in terms of the mood of the characters that one is dealing with?
Not necessarily.
Well, I wonder if that was one of the reasons of
no.
putting this particular passage, because I could remember passages from Atlas, which did seem to me to be descriptions of nature. When she was off in the country, you remember? When she ran away? There was quite a lot in there, which was much, more objective, in a way.
No, it's the same method. Now, but first you have two questions here. One is that part of the romantic method always to see through the eyes of some person? No, not necessarily. True, it is that here. But in fact, it is and it isn't. And in this sense, I state that this is written from the viewpoint of a woman sitting in the window of that train. So this is what she sees. I don't, however, necessarily imply that this is what she feels. This is what she sees, and this is what it looks like. Meaning, not that nature without an observer could look like that. It's necessarily written from a human viewpoint. But it's a human viewpoint which is not expressed in her estimate of the scene. She doesn't put her emotion into the description. This is what the sunset looks like. Who was next? I think maybe.
Wouldn't this be true, that a romantic writer would never simply describe nature in and of itself? That he would always use descriptions to serve some purpose within the context of the scene he's creating, the mood of the participants of the scene, or to set not only a mood setting, but in some way to complement the general theme of the paragraph of the chapter of the novel such.
In a way, yes, but here you have to be... please, don't raise your hands while we're speaking. Wait until the next speaker, because I already have a waiting line here. Marianne, yes and no. There's two different aspects. One is, as a general rule, would there be anything in the principles of a romantic school of writing that would make it necessary to describe nature only as a compliment to men? No. As a general rule, that could not be claimed. Now, the second part of the question is it true that I do it that way? Yes. There isn't a single description, anything I've ever written that is not from the aspect of a person in that scene. But what we have to differentiate is that it's not from the aspect of the person's emotions being projected in the scene. When we get to the last one of these quotations, which is from Thomas Wolfe, you will see the difference. In his description of New York, he does not differentiate between what is being seen and what the characters feel. And one is not related to the other. If I say that I always make descriptions of nature part of the person's mood, I mean something else. Now I wonder whether this is what you meant, Marianne. That I write about nature or any description always on the aspect of a setting. If we were speaking in terms of the theater, nature to me is always a setting for men. And if you ask me why, I can justify it. It's not an arbitrary choice. Because that is my metaphysical view of nature. Its purpose is to be used by men. Now, purpose, not teleologically, not that it was created by any conscious intention for that purpose, but that is the purpose which a human being would ascribe to nature. Nature to a human being is of interest only as his material or his setting. And therefore my metaphysics would be expressed in that approach to any description of nature, that is always as part or as setting, as background for men, not an end in itself, considered separately from the characters or the scene taking place. But that isn't the same thing as saying that it's non-objective. Now, does that answer your remark?
The question I was going to ask, now I'd like to ask a branch off on it, since you've answered that part. To strictly adhere to the Romantic school, wouldn't you have to describe nature in essentials?
Yes.
Which would mean you would have to be giving some kind of value connotation to it, in the sense of a wound in the sky. You would have to be setting some kind of mood by the description by taking essentials rather than just a sun and trees, or instead of cataloging.
Well, yes. In a sense in which every description, even naturalistic, is selective. But a romantic school description will be describing essentials and not too many unrelated details.
And will the essentials be used to fit in with the feeling or idea that's trying to be expressed in the paragraph or chapter or characters around? Not strictly in yourself now, but in the Romantic school in general.
To fit in, to be integrated, yes, but it would not necessarily have to be quite as personal as it is in this particular paragraph. Now, when you say compared to a wound, well, that, and you ask whether that is valid slanted or man slanted.
No, what I'm saying is that you have the twilight restraining sky without the wound of the sunset. This is not a description in the sense that you're cataloging. You're taking some kind of essentials here.
No, it's a metaphor.
Yeah, metaphor.
But not every metaphor is necessarily value slanted, because no matter what you compare it to, so long as you use a metaphor, you're already drawing an abstraction between two concretes.
What I'm asking, I guess, is, doesn't the Romantic school describe nature metaphorically?
No. Oh, no. Not necessarily. And that would be a disastrous method. Because to describe only by means of metaphor would mean to indulge in very generalized floating abstraction. Here's what it would have to be. Cut out the first part of this description and just say, start in effect by saying it was evening and she said the window of a train, and the next sentence would be, the twilight was draining the sky without the wound of a sunset. Now that would be a floating abstraction. It wouldn't have the effect that it has here. Can you tell me why not?
Well, because you haven't made your transition to the round stretch of prairie.
Exactly. I have not made it specific. And you see, I give you very specific objective details here, which are not a metaphor. That is, that there is an empty brown stretch of prairie, and the sky is covered with clouds. And there are a rusty graying shade and solid spread so that you won't see the sun setting. First, I had to describe the essentials of what kind of landscape is beyond the windows. Then, when I use a metaphor, that metaphor fits. Knowing that it's a brown prairie and a stretch of clouds, the metaphor of a sky being drained without the wound of a sunset becomes convincing. Had I started with that metaphor, it will be very vague floating abstraction and very unclear, because the immediate question would be, where did the sunset go? How come? Why is it a twilight without a sunset? I had to first give you the physical essentials of the kind of landscape, then to give you the exact mood of the nature of that sunset. I used the metaphor because, strictly speaking, what I had to say in content was that the clouds covered the sky so that one could not see the sunset. But if I say without the wound of a sunset, that both covers the information and conveys the mood. Jim?
I'm confused by the question that was raised as to whether the romantic school always uses nature as a setting and background for man. Does any writer ever describe nature for any other purpose, unless he's simply trying to bulk up and fill out?
Well, this last is very often true. Properly speaking, in all books of any school, nature is described when it's necessary for a certain kind of scene or event. Mm-hmm. But there are a great many novels in which there are descriptions, lengthy ones, for the sake of description as such, with no particular relation or much longer than is necessary for the scene involved.
I mean, even if your technique were cataloging as the according to nationalist technique, they still have a use for a description of nature in their, as it relates to the action.
As it relates to something in the action of the story, oh yes. But there are also writers of both schools, whether naturalist or romantic, that overwrite in the sense of descriptions for the sake of description, not merely for the sake of a setting to a given scene.
Wouldn't that perhaps be on this premise that they felt some attraction, some liking for some particular scene because they liked it or felt strongly about it? They uncritically just included it in.
Well, that
they thought it.
That we can't judge. I mean, you cannot begin to guess psychologically about subjective things, such as the writer included it because he liked it. That you would have to take a given passage and see by the nature of what is said what the motive could have been, but you can't make a general rule that if a writer describes nature as such is because he liked it and included it uncritically. No, not necessarily. He might attach some kind of special value to description of nature and therefore include it consciously. I would say that would be a wrong premise. I can't think offhand of any valid reason for describing nature for the sake of nature. But that is a point open to debate. If a writer has such a premise, you can debate the premise with him, but you would have to say that if that was his premise, he carried it out, not that he was unconsciously overwriting. That depends on his premise in regard to nature, his view of nature.
I just wanted to comment on the question. It seems to me there is a metaphysical premise here, and that is that the writer who leans very heavily on descriptions, particularly descriptions of nature, is essentially trying to show the place of man in the world. He's using that as the setting, but his view of the setting of man is as a small atom in an enormous
that could be one of the premises, yes.
Therefore, in order to properly set the stage for your characters, it would be necessary to go through a whole chapter, for instance, about the countryside and the mountains and all of that.
You mean in the sense of giving a predominant importance
That's right.
to nature as such, and then human figures then have given less attention, in effect, and that is the scale of the author's view of man's relation to nature.
That's right. Then they proceed right
could
into
be.
the story. But I mean, many writers, for instance, I don't remember exactly what period it was, but there was a period when books primarily opened with long descriptions.
Oh, yes, 19th century or late 19th century, very many of them.
That was one of the premises.
Probably. Now, have I answered your question about whether it's written from Dagny's viewpoint? Are you clear on the distinction of where it is and where it isn't? See, the metaphor alone does not make it necessarily from Dagny's viewpoint. I could use the same description without naming the train. I could, or without referring to anyone sitting at the window. I could have started the same paragraph and say a train was going through a prairie, etc., etc., and the same description would remain, because it is a description of what the place actually looks like. And the metaphor creates the kind of human mood that it would imply from whose viewpoint the author saw the characters in the story. In that sense, it's slanted writing. But it's not just from the description, from the viewpoint of the character. But then again, as I said before, all writing is slanted writing. It's only a question of whether that slant is clear-cut or hidden and vague, but it's always there anyway. All writing has to be selected. Shall we read the next one, and then we'll have a break. Now, this is from the 7 Gothic Tales by Asik Dennison.
The road rises more than 500 feet and winds through tall pine forest. From time to time, this opens and affords a magnificent view over large stretches of land below. Now, in the afternoon sun, the trunks of the fir trees were turning red, and the landscape far away seemed cool, all blue and pale gold. Boris was able now to believe what the old gardener at the convent had told him when he was a child, that he had once seen about this time of the year and the day a herd of unicorns come out of the woods to graze upon the sunny slopes. The white and dappled mares, rosy in the sun, treading daintily and looking around for their young. The old stallion, darker roan, sniffing and pawing the ground. The air here smelled of fir leaves and toadstools and was so fresh that it made him yawn. And yet he thought it was different from the freshness of spring. The courage and gaiety of it were tinged with despair. It was the finale of the symphony.
Now, who wants to come in?
I think this passage, in conjunction with the rest of Dennison that I've read, shows that she is a woman who writes, who likes to exercise her fancy, and who is not particularly addicted to concretes.
Not particularly what?
Addicted to concretes. She, I don't think she's ever written anything but a fantasy story, at least to my knowledge. And the way in which she describes nature bears this out also. When she says that she mentions mythical unicorns.
Well, but that is a concrete.
It's mythical.
That's a different issue. I mean, that in the realm of fantasy. Well, that's true, but don't be influenced in analyzing this by the fact of knowing that she writes fantastic stories. That's a different issue. She does write fantastic stories, and her style is very beautifully adapted to it. But in this particular description, the stylistic essence of it is not that she uses unicorns, which is a fantastic symbol. Observe the method that she used to describe things. Marianne?
I think that there are concretes in the passage, but as a total, they do not sum up to one general abstraction. And
you don't, or you do?
I don't think so. And the last sentence, or the last 2 sentences, were totally surprised because she's not describing the finale of a symphony, to take it literally, or even the end of something, or something coming to a stop. I mean, there are many concretes, but they seem to be unrelated and unintegrated.
I don't agree with you. But let me analyze this, because the exact opposite is true. Now, this particular description is strictly in the romantic style. Now, I think Dennison is hard to classify because she certainly is not a naturalist, and she's not a romantic either. She is primarily a fantasy writer, legend writer, but of the two wide classifications, she's certainly nearer to the romantic than to the naturalistic. And this is one of the most beautiful descriptions I've ever seen in the Romantic style. If we take the Romantic style to be, in essence, the description by means of essentials, but giving you the concretes, not floating abstractions, then observe exactly what she has done. First, she describes, gives you a general idea of the setting, that is a winding road rising into a pine forest. And now she begins to give you the particulars. She gives you just a few essentials, that it's an afternoon sun, that the trunks of the fir trees were burning red, and the landscape far away seemed cool, all blue and pale gold. First of all, the contrast between the burning red tree trunks and a cool, pale blue and pale gold landscape far below, beyond the trunks. Now, first, you get a very attractive generalized picture by means of the few essentials, the red trunks and the suggestion of the pale colors of the landscape far away. Now, she does a very unusual, very difficult trick. I mean, very difficult stylistically, that is beautifully done, and that's what I wanted you to observe. She wants to convey the mood of this kind of landscape and to give you the feeling of the general picture, which would be wider and more essential than if she described more leaves or branches or grass. And she introduced this peculiar device of saying that Boris was able to believe what the old gardener of the convent had told him when he was a child, that he has seen about this time of the year and the day a herd of unicorns come out of the woods to graze upon the sunny slopes. Now observe how many connotations the author is using. First of all, it's an old gardener at a convent telling something to a child. Therefore, it has that fantastic eerie quality to begin with. And the gardener has told him that he had seen unicorns, which is, of course, impossible, but it's the use of that impossible fantasy that projects the exact eerie quality of the afternoon. What is very significant and very skillful are the words about this time of the year and the day. That's where the author shows the intention. It's not just to indulge in a fantasy of unicorns, but that at this time of year and the day, the sunlight on these trees and slope had that kind of eerie, almost fantastic quality in which you could expect the supernatural. Then observe that as she goes to describe the unicorns, they are made extremely specific in a very unusually artistic way, in the sense that it's almost over-detailed, but over-detailed by essentials, and only those essentials are given which will fit the purpose that the author wants to establish. That the mares were white and dappled and rosy in the sun, which is another way of reminding you of the quality of the late afternoon sunlight, which would make white objects rosy and the tree trunks burning red. Observe how carefully the color scheme is projected by means of a fantasy. And the mares are trading daintily. Now, you know, the kind of, conveys the kind of steps that elegant race horses would use, yet you're talking about unicorns, which gives it even a more dainty or fantastic quality. The old stallion, darker roan, again the color scheme very carefully suggested, sniffing and pawing the ground. You see, it has by giving this detail, the author has given reality to the fantastic, and by giving reality to the fantastic, she's given the whole mood of this eerie, quiet afternoon sunlight. Then observe the next sentence is completely realistic. The air here smelled of fir leaves and toadstools, and was so fresh that it made him yawn, which I think is a brilliant sentence. You know what? Again, the very essentials are selected. When you combine fir trees and toadstools, plus the freshness which made him yawn, you can almost literally smell that forest from that sentence. And it's done by the greatest economy of just the right words and nothing more. And then, you see, and yet he thought it was different from the freshness of spring. Now, may I observe that when it said that it's different from the freshness of spring, you can infer that this is fall. It's fall afternoon, not spring. The courage and gaiety of it were tinged with despair. It was the finale of the symphony. You know what would imply, without the other having said it, that this is fall? And what justifies the finale of the symphony is all that eerie fantasy that has gone before, the air of something unusual, supernatural, and in gold, pink, red shades. The air of something almost slightly decadent. When you have a realistic description of unicorns prancing around in the hillside, which is fresh and wholesome in the sense of leaves, fir leaves, and toadstools, and suddenly has a suggestion of unicorns and fantasy in the supernatural, there is something decadent about it, something fantastic. And that last sentence kind of sums up the whole effect. It was the finale of the symphony.
When you analyze it, I can see it. But reading it alone, I was not able to grasp any of the essentials which you pointed out. Maybe.
Or would you say I point out arbitrarily, or are they there?
You made it very objective what the connections were and the use of color, and made it, in fact, much more real than I think the author had.
But I haven't added anything that wasn't there. I mean, the matter there is only a reading that was giving full conscious value to every word. That is, absorb every word of it. Not analytically, but just hold it in your mind and see what it adds up to. It adds up to just the kind of things that I elaborated, but which I didn't state arbitrarily. All that.
Well, I said she didn't use concrete. Now, I still think that I think that I have a misidentification of the nature of concrete. Because to me, an allusion to something mythical, no matter how well described, is not the concrete.
Well, it's a concrete in the sense that it projects for you the kind of mood of the scene that the author intended, and it projects it by means of a fantastic concrete. Thus, if you say it was the kind of landscape where unicorns would be appropriate.
Specific unicorns.
Yes, specific unicorns. And she indicates why, because of the odd coloring in the late afternoon sunlight and the kind of unicorns that would match it. Now she has given you a very specific description of that hillside in that forest and no other at this time of year and day. Now, that is what I mean by a concrete. That is, she has given you specific images, such as the fir trees, the colors, the unicorns, even the colors and gestures of the unicorns to convey the mood of that hillside, plus even the smell of it, the perspective, and the slant of the sun. Those are concrete, as distinguished from a description which would have said it was an eerie, fantastic landscape, beautiful but tragic, lovely but heartbreaking, a la Thomas Wolfe. Now, you see, those would not be concrete. Those would be undefined floating abstraction.
Just one more thing on that. I see all these other touches are good concrete, which I have missed. But now, with respect to the unicorns, I would think they're abstractions in this sense. No reader can ever have seen one, which don't exist. The degree of concreteness must be much less than any existent concrete, any actual concrete.
Oh no, you're using the word there in a different sense. I mean, you have all seen a unicorn in a painting or in a tapestry. You know that it's an animal vaguely like a horse, with a few adaptations. Therefore, if any author uses a fantasy figure which is visually known to the reader, that is a concrete.
The issue is basically whether or not you can visualize.
Whether you can visualize, yes. I mean, if you use angels or sphinx or centaurs, The question there is not whether they exist or not for purposes of a description, but can you project them visually? Yes, you can. And unicorn here is used not only for the purpose of a physical description, but precisely because it's a fantastic creature. She could just as well have used a herd of horses, but it wouldn't have produced that effect, because the purpose was to suggest something supernatural and odd, and almost decadently frightening, but very attractive. I will take the last 4 quotations, which will be all descriptions of New York. Would you read number 9? And that's from the fountain.
From the train, he looked back once at the skyline of the city as it flashed into sight and was held for some moments beyond the windows. The twilight had washed off the details of the buildings. They rose in thin shafts of a soft porcelain blue, a color not of real things but of evening and distance. They rose in bare outlines like empty molds waiting to be filled. The distance had flattened the city. The single shafts stood immeasurably tall, out of scale to the rest of the earth. They were of their own world, and they held up to the sky the statement of what man had conceived and made possible. They were empty molds, but man had come so far he could go farther. The city on the edge of the sky held a question and a promise.
And anyone wants to comment on the essence of the message? If not, I will. Pardon? Are you out of the script? You have to use at least 2 to a script. Is that trouble?
No, I was, we just played we can do this.
The particular number 9? This is quotation number 9. You have? Now what I wanted to show you here is the method of presenting first, again, the specific description, the visual description of the city, done by means of essentials in order to give an idea of the visual presentation. Then, the symbolic or intellectual presentation. You notice what I do here. The first part of the description is the description of the city as such, the physical description. Then, the meaning of that physical description is the last part. And it's tied together by the concept of the empty mold, which is a concept legitimate in both contexts. That is, you know, the way the buildings would look at a distance when the details are not seen. It will be looking like an empty mold. And then the transition to the philosophical meaning is done in this sentence: the single shaft to the measurable tall, out of scale to the rest of the earth. And you see the sense in which that is a double meaning sentence. First, it's literally true, visually. That is the way those skyscrapers look at a distance. And when I have said they're out of scale with the rest of the earth, I'm already in the philosophical or symbolic meaning. And then I deliberately emphasize it in the next sentence. I make the next step. They were of their own world. Well, that could apply to their size and, of course, to their meaning. And they held up to the sky the statement of what men had conceived and made possible. Then I repeat, they were empty molds, but men had come so far, he could go farther. And I said, there, the empty molds are used strictly in the symbolic philosophical sense, in the sense that they were a promise. And if you know the context, if you remember, that's the passage at the end of part 1 of the Fountainhead, when Rourke has to leave the city to go to work in the granite quarry. The meaning of this passage in relation to him is very clear. The city at the edge of the sky held a question and a promise. Question in the sense that in his particular position at this moment, he cannot be sure what the future will be. But the statement of what men had conceived and made possible, the fact that men could go farther, meaning Rourke, of course, constitutes the promise. So in that sense, without saying in so many words, what I'm conveying here is the inspirational quality of the site of the city, inspirational to Rourke in this particular context, and inspirational in a wider sense, general. Here is the city as a symbol of human achievement, which it is in fact, and which is here stressed philosophically. I mean, that's the method used in this particular quotation. Now, any comments before we go to the next one? Or is this clear? All right. The next one is, in effect, same method. Yes?
A question on number 9. They rose and zoomed fast with a soft porcelain blue, color not of real things, but of evening and distance. What is the metaphor of a color of distance? Second,
the kind that's for
I don't know what the color of evening is. Evening has a distinctive color, a gray.
Distance is always a bluish gray, evening or daytime. In other words, it's for searching for saying the kind of color that seems assumed at a distance. All right, then the next one, that's from Atlas Shrugged.
Clouds had wrapped the sky and had descended as fog to wrap the streets below, as if the sky were engulfing the city. She could see the whole of Manhattan Island, a long triangular shape cutting into an invisible ocean. It looked like the prow of a sinking ship. A few tall buildings still rose above it like funnels, but the rest was disappearing under gray-blue coils, going down slowly into vapor and space. This was how they had gone, she thought. Atlantis, the city that sank into the ocean, and all the other kingdoms that vanished, leaving the same legend in all the languages of men, and the same longing.
Now, you see, the method here is exactly the same. That is, I first give you the exact description by means of essentials of what Manhattan Island looked like. Then I proceed to go to the symbolic meaning, that is Atlantis, the city sinking underwater. And Manhattan, in fact, does look like the prow of a ship, but you've seen it from a tall building with the funnels. And the purpose of the slight repetition and at the end is precisely that, because not an exact repetition. Observe that I said the rest was disappearing under gray-blue coils. That's the physical description of what it looked like. Going down slowly into vapor and space is the philosophical switch, because it stresses. Going into space stresses the vanishing. That gives the implication of the sinking city. And then, if you remember what follows this, her speech that has to do with Atlantis. What I wanted to show you here is the method by which one can integrate into one description, yet keep separately very clear the physical description and the philosophical meaning derived from that description. And I want you to observe that the philosophical meaning in both cases is legitimately derived from the physical description. Just as in the first case, it was legitimate after describing tall buildings that rise above, out of scale to the rest of the city, the transition to the conclusion that they in effect represent the shape of human achievement was a legitimate, logical connection. That is the kind of conclusion which is logically justified from the description given. Same here is the physical description. In the physical description, you see, warrants the idea of a sinking city, I had to first give you the physical context that would make the city appear as if it's vanishing. I go into the conclusion. I want you to keep that in mind when we come to the last of these quotations, which follows a totally different method than that's Thomas Wolfe. But for the moment, we'll go to number 11, which is not a naturalistic description. And this is from Mickey Spillane. Would you read number 11?
Nobody ever walked across the bridge, not on a night like this. The rain was misty enough to be almost fog-like, a cold grey curtain that separated me from the pale ovals of white that were faces, locked behind the steamed-up windows of the cars that hissed by. Even the brilliance that was Manhattan by night was reduced to a few sleepy yellow lights off in the distance. Someplace over there I had left my car and started walking, burying my head in the collar of my raincoat with the night pulled in around me like a blanket. I walked and I smoked and I flicked the spent butts ahead of me and watched them march to the pavement and fizzle out with one last wink. If there was life behind the buildings on either side of me, I didn't notice it. The street was mine, all mine. They gave it to me gladly and wondered why I wanted it so nice and all alone.
No, any comments?
I just have a general comment that he does write in a romantic style and does get the essences, the cigarette butt, flipping. There's a tiny thing that characterize him and give the general mood.
Exactly. That's right.
There's only one thing that I don't like, and that's in the very last sentence. He wanted it so nice and all alone and nice. I think it's the only word in the whole thing that isn't quite nice.
I'm going to agree with you. I'll comment on that.
I was going to mention also that this is the very clear example of using essences for description. Almost rain is misting up, almost fog-like, cold gray curtain, pale ovals of white, green by windows, this fly. This is extremely good.
That's right.
Brilliance was reduced to sleepy yellow lights in distance. And this I think is a fine piece here, with a nice pulled in around him like a blanket. It's a fine way to describe someone who has his collar up around him.
That's right.
Reminds me of Cipriano's looking for cool space on the pillow, something that I never thought of in quite that way.
You don't mean that this is the same kind of thing. You mean only that it has the same effect of something that you have experienced but haven't identified.
That's it. Again, flip the smoke button and watch them arch the pavement and fizzle out one last wink. Well, even better.
Terrific. That last phrase is terrific. Fizzle out. Walked away.
Yeah.
And then, but the one thing it does not seem to fit, at least I don't quite like, is they gave it to me gladly, and wondered why I wanted it so nice and all alone. This is certainly not a little use of words. This is, again, this is the same problem that I brought up last time, except
well, this is a sort of a metaphor. I don't know what one should call it a metaphor, what exactly, but it's a little too stretched. There's something wrong with that last sentence. I will comment on it later. What is your objection, or can you identify it?
Well, he says that there was light behind the windows, I didn't notice it, and that everybody was minding their own business behind these steam-up windows. No one seems to be paying attention to him. And here he says, they wondered why I wanted it so nice and all along. It's not very unlikely that they're thinking about him at all, these other people. And they gave it to me, and then what he says, they gave it to me gladly. This is, it's not the correct way of looking at it. I can't...
No, it's not meant to be taken literally, of course.
No, I know that. It's sort of, I think that his heroic feeling is based on wrong concrete, I feel.
It's not a heroic feeling, actually. That's projected here. Did you think that's what it's intended? That's a heroic feeling? No.
No, it's not a heroic feeling. It's projected in the beginning, but at the end, when he says, it was mine, all mine, they gave it to me gladly, they gave it to me gladly, and it was mine, all mine, he's feeling some sort of exalted possessiveness, I suppose.
Well, why do you assume that? Just because by our philosophy the word mind is supposed to be something good?
No, because it says mine, won't mine.
The context doesn't warrant it, and that's a
that I know.
case where you have to judge every sentence in context.
Well, if this is not warranted by the context, then I would wonder why do you repeat it and say mine, all mine? Let's say that was not school.
All right, I'll complete. Oh, wait, let's go into an argument. I just want you to comment on as much as you can identify, and then I will analyze it for you. You want to comment on that?
Well, I just felt that he did imply a contradiction very clearly, which I don't think he meant to imply. That when he said they gave it to me gladly, what he meant to carry by that sentence, I believe, was they had abandoned it to me.
That's it. More like that.
Not that they had paid attention to me and given me a present of the city, but that they had displayed the city and were staying inside, and therefore, by default, it was mine. But this is not absolutely clear.
No, it's actually sarcasm. That's the intention here. But now, let me then analyze the total for you. To begin with, you're right about the fact that this is romantic writing. In what sense? In the sense Kathy mentioned, that he does select the essentials. He describes the scene by means of the kind of essentials which are characteristic and which will give you the mood, and they're very well selected. For instance, the cold gray curtain that separated me from the pale ovals of white that were faces locked behind the steamed up windows of the cars that hissed by. I think he combines tremendous description with very great economy into one sentence. And contrary to Mr. Cousins, who is supposed to be a literary writer, and this is supposed to be the man that nobody gives any literary credit to, compare the literary styles. There was the man going into the kind of grammatical sentences that we had to argue about which way to read it, and finally decided it's total impossible grammatical jumble. And here, a very complex set of descriptions is done very condensed into one single sentence. For instance, if a man is walking alone in the rain, now there's a great many sights around him, but observe that he selects to feature the ones which are most typical of this kind of mood. Now this is the exactly counter-naturalist writing. Because certainly there were wet pavements and probably street lights and tin cans or garbage pails, but that was not the essence of the description of the setting he wants to establish. But what would be very typical? The faces in the cars. And he doesn't, now a lesser writer would have said just the faces. But he gives you the exact visual description of what those faces would look like under those circumstances. They're pale ovals of white that were faces. Because actually that is the way it would be seen. First just ovals of white, and you or the man in the story would know that those are faces. But he gives you the exact visual projection very briefly. And what's very artistic here is the word locked behind the steamed up windows. Now they're not in fact locked, but the impression of faces going by in a small compartment would be that, and using the word locked rather than seated or visible or some conventional word is a very economical, very artistic way of projecting the exact description. And the cars hissing by. You know what cars sound like, particularly when it's wet pavement and probably splashing water. There is extreme artistic sensitivity and very tight essential selection. And that is the man that they say can't write. I've always wanted to throw that particular description at the faces of any critic that attacks him, because this is really literary talent. Unfortunately, he doesn't always live up to it. He has some very sloppy and very bad passages in some of his writing, but you judge a literary talent like you judge an intelligence, not by the average, but by his best potential, by that which he has demonstrated his best. If he can do this, it means he could bring all of his writing up to that standard if he wanted to. If he doesn't, that's different issue. That's the writer's own problem. But in judging literary capacity, this is what you judge by the best that the writer has demonstrated. Now, the next paragraph. The color, the raised color of his raincoat and the night pulled in around me like a blanket. Again, that is a very colorful description. Colorful in the sense of he names the essential and he gives you a feel of the exact sensation of what it's like to be walking with a raised color on a foggy night. The next sentence, as everybody observed, is probably the best because it accomplishes two things. It does indicate the character of the man who is walking. A man who is walking, smoking many cigarettes and flipping the butt. And then the exact description, he watched them arch to the pavement. Now he didn't say fall, he didn't say drop, he used a verb which gave you the exact description of the way in which they fall. It's that kind of precision that achieves the best effect with the greatest economy. It's the selection of the exact word. He could have said that fell in an arched line or described the curve. Or a sloppy writer would have suggested they fell. But he selected one verb. In fact, it's a slightly manufactured verb, because I don't think there is such a verb as to arch. But it's perfectly legitimate in this context, perfectly clear what he's doing. And he's giving a very graphic, essential description with a minimum of words. And of course, the lost wing is the best typesetter. That one last spark sets the mood of the whole thing. Now, from this point on, the last three sentences, are not as good, unfortunately. Because here's where his colloquialism starts in. Now, the use of the colloquial style, particularly in this case where it's a story written in the first person, is perfectly proper. And in the sentences where I walked and I smoked and I flipped the spent butts, etc., this is a sentence which is written colloquially in the sense that it's not fancy literary English, and yet it's very high literary quality of colloquial writing. That is, said simply, it's said in a tone in which this type of character would think or say it. But there's extreme artistic care behind it. Now, from that point on, he let his focus or his standard slip a little. Because he said, if there was light behind the windows of the building on either side of me, I didn't notice it. That is a little easier, less distinguished way of describing something. Now here he wants to describe the loneliness of the street. And to say that if there was light, I didn't notice it, is simply not colorful enough. Although it's adequate. I mean, he does convey what he wants, only the means there are not particularly brilliant. Now the next two sentences are the ones to which you objected. In the context, since he's describing a nasty night, and the tone of something sarcastic, bitter, and ominous is set very early in the whole atmosphere. For instance, someplace over there I had left my car, and I walked and I smoked a flip spent butt. You know that there's something tense and ominous going on. Therefore, the line, the street was mine. All mine couldn't be any heroic projection, because for that sentence to imply something heroic or exultant, some sort of preparation or context would be needed. But when he says that there's no life around him, only hissing cars and burning cigarette butts, in that context that the street is all his, has a sarcastic sound. It is a somewhat bitter sentence. When he says they gave it to me gladly and wonders why I wanted it so nice and all alone, that obviously is not meant literally, since there's nobody around. It's a sarcastic sentence in the sense that everybody else was either asleep or away, and it seemed as if the people had given him the street and only wondered why he wanted it. So again, that is not a literal sentence. In the context, it's obviously a sarcastic sentence directed at the mood in general and establishing his own position in the city. Now, what is very bad is the ungrammatical, the real grammatical error of saying, why I wanted it so nice and all alone. That's just grammatically bad. When you use colloquialism, there is no reason to use it in crude grammar form as he does here. Now, I wanted it so nice. It's something that one could say in dialogue, and the tone of voice might imply the sarcastic meaning, but the word is extremely out of key with all the rest of the paragraph and the intention. And also when he says, why I wanted it all alone, the two together, why I wanted it so nice and why I wanted it all alone, do not make it too clear a grammatical sentence. It's the kind of sentence which, if a writer were dictating, he might get away with it by his tone of voice or the manner in which it was said. But on paper, it just does not come off. And the reason why you would be uneasy about that sentence is that, in fact, it's a sentence which is slightly off focus. You sort of know what he means, but it's only sort of. And after the exact precision and the economy of the preceding paragraph, it stands out more as out of key. Now, I included it in order to show you the whole description, but in effect, that kind of carelessness in connection with the better writing is characteristic of Spillane, unfortunately. And the only lesson to learn from it is this: no matter what your talent, if you let your focus sleep on any sentence or paragraph, it's not going to write itself automatically. That is a very good example of the nature of human free will and of focus. Even if you have very good literary premises, very sensitively developed observation, as he obviously shows here, if on any one sentence or passage you're not too interested, you're merely just filling space to get to the next step, this will be the result. It will show in a certain kind of dropping or slackening of your workmanship. Therefore, the moral to be drawn from this particular passage is, when you write, focus equally on every part of what you're writing, whether it's the big key sentence, the big paragraph, or the little transition paragraph. Not all of them have to be equally brilliant or equally significant, but all of them have to be written with the same kind of care. Here he obviously let his focus slip. He just jumped down where on the preceding sentences, it is if a man were concentrating very sharply on visualizing what he wanted, the scene that he wanted to describe, and on selecting the right words for it. But now, any comment on this?
It is correct. In the sentence, she was mine only. The purpose was to be sarcastic. Wouldn't it have been better to say the street was, just simply say the street was mine, and then they gave it to me gladly? Why the repetition?
But I think the all mine is what makes it sarcastic. The street was mine by itself, it wouldn't particularly convey too much.
But no, but followed by they gave it to me gladly. Well, if there was a possibility of my being confused when he said the street was mine, all mine, it stemmed from the repetition, which seemed that, to me, to indicate that he was enjoying the street being his in spite of the bleak night. I don't think it's really objective, this one.
I don't think it's objective either way. It's slightly too vague in either case.
I believe I remember that wouldn't it be like clear in context that sarcasm was intended there?
Well, in further context, because this is unabridged. I mean, this is the first two paragraphs starting the novel. It's the beginning of the novel, One Lonely Night. I think further context later on does present more clearly the mood of bitterness of the, it's my camera writing, of course.
Yeah.
The mood of bitterness and all is made clear in the subsequent paragraph, but up to this point, this is uncut, the first two paragraphs. It's hard to argue about this particular sentence, that the street was mine, because it's not too objective a sentence. However, one thing is sure, that no mood of exaltation could be projected from it in this context. Anyone else? All right, now let's take the last one, and that is Thomas Wolfe from The Web in the Rock.
That hour, that moment, and that place struck with a peerless coincision upon the very heart of his own youth, the crest and zenith of his own desire. The city had never seemed as beautiful as it looked that night. For the first time he saw that New York was supreme among the cities of the world, the city of the night. There had been achieved here a loveliness that was astounding and incomparable, a kind of modern beauty inherent to its place and time that no other place nor time could match. He realized suddenly that the beauty of other cities of the night, of Paris spread below one from the Butte Sacré-Cœur in its vast mysterious blossoms of nocturnal radiance, of London with its smoky nimbus of fogged light, which was so peculiarly thrilling because it was so vast, so lost in the illimitable, had each its special quality so lovely and mysterious, but had yet produced no beauty that could equal this. The city blazed there in his vision in the frame of night, and for the first time his vision phrased it as it had never done before. It was a cruel city, but it was a lovely one, a savage city, yet it had such tenderness, a bitter, harsh, and violent catacomb of stone and steel and tunneled rock, slashed savagely with light, and roaring, fighting a constant, ceaseless warfare of men and of machinery. And yet it was so sweetly and so delicately pulsed, as full of warmth, of passion, and of love as it was full of hate.
This is an archetype of what you mean by non-concretization.
That's right.
This is, he does it masterfully.
He what?
He has never seen.
He does it masterfully.
And this is that night. Why? He doesn't say, he just goes on, he says for the first time at night he saw New York was supremely the city of the night, which means nothing in particular. He goes on to say there was loveliness, there was astounding, incomparable. Incomparable to what? You know, a kind of modern beauty, you know, it's a kind of thing in particular. He's trying to get it there some way. He knows that modern beauty itself isn't enough, so he says a kind of modern beauty, and I think that'll solve it.
Mm-hmm.
And he says inherent with place and time, he's admitting defeat.
Why admitting defeat? In the sense that he doesn't know
Instead of
what to say.
He says it's inherent with place and time. He says you should know why it's pretty.
In effect, yes, you're probably right about that.
What a place with time could match. Why couldn't they match it? But, well, anyway, he goes through this whole paragraph, but then at the end, like in the second paragraph, he does something which you just literally warned us not to do. He says, I think he has a good image here of this bitter, harsh, and violent catacomb of stone and steel and tunneled rock. That is granting his philosophical premises, he has a good image. But he has no right to give us such a metaphor unless he's given us the concrete first.
Exactly.
And that's all I had. You want to look at the whole thing.
It's a very good time.
Right. Yeah, that's the essence of the trouble. I'll add more. Bob?
Read the entire thing, but after reading it, if you look away and say, what did Wolf tell me about New York? The answer is nothing.
Now that is the essential trouble. That there is not one word here which is New York, nor for that matter Paris or London, which he then attempts to bring in.
Stop the girl.
That's the point of view from which you're seeing what?
There are blossoms with nocturnal radiance.
Really?
He says that New York is uncomfortable, and then he goes on to compare it with two other cities.
And does not say what was uncomfortable, nor why, in what way New York was different.
And he doesn't have a penchant for fixing on certain words, but he uses lovely, beauty, beautiful, and mysterious. And he uses each of these words about 3 or 4 times.
And then savage, twice in one paragraph. A savage city / savagery. Wait, don't, this is not general discussion yet. I just wanted first to comment on the essence, and let me give you my observation, then comments, unless you have something to oppose or disagree with what was said. All right, then let me first go over it. Now, the essence you've named, that is, that the worst fault in this type of writing is the floating abstraction. This is the complete divorcement from concrete. In fact, project for a moment that he's not talking about a view of a city, but just of a plane at night. And he could use exactly the same description. The plains of New Jersey were incomparable to the plains of Brittany or Normandy or something, and all the rest of the adjectives and the emotions could belong to it if he wanted to, because this is totally subjective. The reader is not at any point let in on the reasons of why he is saying any of those things and why he thinks of the city in this particular way. This is as subjective a description as one could put on paper, in the sense that it's all estimates. And you're never told what it is he's estimating. To begin with, he does not attempt to give you a single concrete that would differentiate New York. The overall mistake, you see, is that he epistemologically here cannot distinguish between the subject and the object, between the sight of New York and what that sight makes him feel. It's written as one package deal. He feels something and he projects that as if it were a description of the city. In other words, it's that epistemological error where an emotion is supposed to be taken as if it were perception. As if he had said something about New York by saying that New York made him feel that it was lovely. But in fact now the lovely is an estimate based on something he hasn't told you. What about the side made him decide that it's lovely? But in fact now the lovely is an estimate based on something he hasn't told you. What about the side made him decide that it's lovely? And when you go into the particular things he says, a whole series of unanswered whys. For instance, he says, the city had never seemed as beautiful as it looked that night. He never tells you why. Now New York is supremely the city of the night. He doesn't say why or what a city of the night as distinguished from a city of the day would be. I mean, what is the meaning of this observation? There had been achieved here a loveliness that was astounding and incomparable. Why? A kind of modern beauty inherent to its place and time that no other place nor time could match. What is modern beauty? Now he uses a term and doesn't indicate at all what he means by it. Then he realized that the beauty of other cities of the night. Now why Paris and London are cities of the night? Again, I don't know. Then the long description had each its special quality, so lovely and mysterious, but had yet produced no beauty that could equal this. He doesn't say what special quality, he doesn't say what's lovely or mysterious about it. But observe that he gives you two generalities about Paris and London, which are interchangeable, because they mean exactly the same things. They're merely words with no content. I mean, words as generalities, not conveying a specific difference. Because if you say vast mysterious blossoms of nocturnal radiance versus smoky nimbus of fog light, which are thrilling because it was so vast, Now, is there any difference between the two? None whatever. Now, you know, in a generalized way, or you can guess by the mere names of New York, London, and Paris, that what he probably was seeing, particularly when he uses the word modern beauty, he was seeing some kind of difference between a city of skyscrapers or a city of older monuments. Just to give you an example in simple terms, if he had at least made an attempt to describe skyscrapers, just to suggest the angular steel structures and the lights, versus the side of spires of churches or ancient domes, or the Big Ben on the Tower of Parliament, or to give some kind of distinction between the site of two historical cities of Europe and the older, lower buildings, the site of a modern American city. That at least would have given meaning to what he's implying here. If he was in his mind thinking of the three cities, he must have seen why he called one modern and the others not. He also must have seen some kind of difference between Paris and London to make him say this, but he didn't identify it even to himself, let alone to the reader. All that he was focusing on as a writer was, well, the three sides made him feel different. And he was putting down some kind of words, again, like in his love scene, to attempting to convey the emotion. Now, you can't convey an emotion as such. You can convey it only by means of that which produced the emotion, or by means of a conclusion that that emotion leads you to. But here he was trying to project an emotion, and what happened? Blossoms of nocturnal radiance, which is neither emotion, nor thought, nor description, but just words. Now, as a very inadvisable method, I want to call your attention to this. Paris spread below one from the butte of Sacré-Cœur. Well, that is as bad as Guy Franklin in Fountainhead using French words ever so often. Remember, to suggest he's a phony, I had him using French words once in a while. You've all observed people who do that. Anyone who throws in foreign words, particularly French, you know what that projects. And here is an author in a serious passage doing exactly that. It's in the order of name dropping, you know, just to show how cosmopolitan and well-traveled he is. That is about all that it would project, whether it was his intention or not. I doubt whether that was intentional. Nevertheless, that's the effect it has. And if you ask me then, what should he have done? Is it ever proper to mention real landmarks? No, if you mention just the geographical name, because then it's a quotation out of a Cook's tour, or out of a label stuck on your luggage to show your friends. Do not mention foreign landmarks, or in fact any landmarks, unless you give some kind of description right along with it to tell the uninitiated what it is. For instance, the butte of Sacré-Cœur mentioned this way, whether the author intended it or not has the implication, well, I am a cosmopolitan traveler and I know, and if you local yokels do not know, that is your fault. I mean, that is what any dropping of foreign, scientific, or any kind of allusions which presuppose some special knowledge on the part of the reader, that is what they always imply. Now, the way to do it properly, if he had wanted to describe a particular site from that particular elevation, then it would be even proper to use the name if he wanted to, provided he had given you some kind of description, like Paris seen from the such and such butte which rises on the banks of the Seine or whatever it is, I wouldn't know, and faces the towers of such and such. In other words, give you some description which would be valid and clear as setting the scene without the name. Then if he wants to give the name for actual geographical authenticity, that is okay. particularly for a naturalistic method. It's all right if you want to, but it is never all right to just sling names. For instance, even if you are writing about New York City, even then, for objectivity of those who have not seen New York, and simply on the principle of never counting on outside knowledge of particulars, you said the Empire State Building rising above the skyline, don't let it go at that. Give some description of the shape of the Empire State, or some brief view of it, then if you want the actual name to be proper to use it. If you just sing the name without any indication, it's only name tossing.
In reference to this name slinging, there's a coincide in the whole concept of the title of Atlas Shrugged. If you had made a reference to Atlas in the book when Francisco was speaking to reason about Atlas, I mean, of course, it's a well-known figure, and it's an assumption that everyone knows what Atlas means, but yet you didn't even conclude, rather than letting it go without a complete but actual reference to him.
You mean, would that be the same thing?
No, I mean, would it be the same thing, but would it have been, or would that be just optional, without including these?
Well, in that sense, it would be optional, because when I'm using Atlas as a symbol, it is such a well-known symbol that if I called it Prometheus Unbound, without any reference to Prometheus in the text, that also would be clear. However, I did include the exact statement because I don't like to leave anything to implication. When anything is important, I personally would consider it, whenever there is a symbolic title, I think the author should use it in the text and explain it.
And then also in reference to Isaac Denison here, in the whole concept of unicorn, it's true no one has ever seen it, but it was valid since it's such a wide concept, and it's more or less an assumption on the author that everyone knows, in fact, what unicorn is supposed to look like. I mean, by drawing, which didn't have to go into a whole description of what unicorn is.
Well, that is somewhat different there, because she didn't describe the unicorn as an animal with a horn in the middle. There she did not give a description of what it is. She assumed that the shape was known. In that case, it's widely enough known to warrant using it that way. It's not the fact of it being widely known or not. It's the fact of a journalistic, factual, specific versus an abstraction. Now, I mean, if she had meant a particular unicorn called Teddy or whichever, then she should describe it. But, I mean, when you use a unicorn, it's like using a cow or a horse. If, however, you mean Mrs. O'Leary's cow that started the Chicago fire, if it's a particular animal, then you better give a reference to what it is, or explain the reference. Don't merely throw it in undefined, because here, in order to have any value, it presupposes that the reader had been in Paris, had stood on this particular elevation, and seen the kind of sight that the author describes, which is totally absent. And it's the kind of knowledge that the author has no right to expect from the reader. I mean, that is taking it out of the confines of the objectivity of telling a story, which the reader has to learn from you, from what you write. You cannot suddenly go into Traveller's Catalog and consider that you have conveyed something. Now, observe a peculiar little sentence in the second paragraph, which supports what I had said earlier, that he does not distinguish between the subject and the object. And for the first time, his vision phrased it as it had never done before. Now, a vision cannot phrase anything. And the reason why it's a very bad statement here is because he unfortunately, in fact, supports it, and he doesn't know that that is the fault in the manner of presentation. If, at this moment, he thinks of all the things that follow here, all his appraisals of the city, he, in fact, believes that it's his vision that is providing him with all this estimate. In other words, that the sight, the mere sight of a city at night is going to tell him that the city is both cruel and kindly, full of love and full of hate. Well, he knows that is not possible. What is missing here is why and how did he see all this? Either he would have to give it specific descriptions of touches or something that would make him conclude that this is a cruel city and a savage city, etc. If it's something that he draws from the vision of this particular night, or perhaps this is drawn from his memory or an estimate of what he knows about the city. In any case, then he has to show you why on this particular night and in this view he is drawn to this kind of conclusion that he doesn't do at all. Then when you have this metaphor here, a catacomb of stone and steel and tunneled rock, slashed savagely with light. I don't think it's a good metaphor. You know why? Too broad, too easy. I mean, a catacomb of stone and steel and tunneled rock. That's who I think was reacted to the saying all blue and gold, and that the word all was a little bit too generalized, wasn't it? You pointed out this is too wide a description, an error of the same order. It is too generalized. When you say about something stone, steel, and tunneled rock, it's so generalized that it can be effective only if and when preceding or following some particulars were given. Then it might be a kind of effective summary, but left by itself, it's just too easy. By too easy, I mean too generalized. Then, of course, the last is almost ridiculous. It was so sweetly and so delicately pulsed. Now, what can be sweet or delicate about the pulse of a city? If he means pulse, the noise or the vibrations. And what's sweet about it? I mean, it's a stretched figure of speech that is preposterous, as full of warmth, of passion, and of love as it was full of hate. It sounds like a bad politician. You know, it's slinging immense generalities with no content at all. No, the real object lesson in this quotation is, of course, what we named from the start. That is, this is the archetype of floating abstractions and of a description which, in fact, describes nothing. Therefore, the further away you stay from this, the better. Now, any comment? There were several reasons, I think.
Just if I can quote an author that you probably wouldn't approve of, it reminded me very much of a sentence of Gertrude Stein's, which was, she loved the beautiful view and loved to sit with her back to it.
I don't know what I would approve. What I would quarrel with is your designation of it as an author. What this passage reminds you of?
Yes. In other words, you couldn't see the view through him.
Oh. I didn't quite get your point. Who else? I think, Vivian, had your hand raised before? Kathy?
My comment is very modest to all that's been said. But in this one sentence, the city had never seen as beautiful as it looked that night. That strikes me as very awkward phrasing. And for he who writes so poetically most of the time, the seemed and it looked.
Very awkward, yes. Flat and just plain inept, yes.
Your metaphor of the politician here is not actually completely out of context. This, in essence, is what, in fact, the political speech is nowadays.
That is true, yes. To sing as many generalities to be misunderstood by the greatest number of people, but never to be specific.
And actually, you do run into, I do think, in fact, that the particular phrase out of context, violent catacomb of stone and steel, is in fact a good phrase until you say catacomb of stone still, where, who, what, when, and so forth.
Well, that's the point.
And like a good political speech, they're taken out of context. Certain words and phrases sound good, but what they apply to is completely beyond everyone who listens.
Might sound good like a mobile, again, in the sense that you are expected to supply the content.
Well, this is a mobile in that sense.
Well, yes. Oh, yes.
Image, the part of that would be good if he supported it with concrete. The specific touch, two touches that make it good: violent catacomb and slash savagely. The savagely and violent are in agreement, one carries out the other, and they're extremely evocative. But I'd like to ask a general question that doesn't bear on this alone, but bears on the entire work from which this was taken. Is there any kind of plot in this work?
In this one, I would not tell you. I have not read it. As far as I know, I don't think he has plots in any of his novels. They're all semi-autobiographical, so almost fully autobiographical, fictionalized autobiography. So that it's written, in effect, in form, like memoirs. It's not plot novels.
What is the nature of the praise that is given to him by critics? What do they put to like about this?
I don't know. I'm not even sure whether critics praised him very much. I know that at the beginning they were very much against him. The nature of his appeal is actually predominantly to young people, and for a very good but misapplied reason, by default. Because in particular time when he was the fashion, that is in the 30s, this is as near as you could come to any serious romantic writing in so-called serious literature. There was nobody else. And the appeal that he has is usually to people under 20. Do you know for what reason? For the reason of being written as a mobile. He presents kind of a general empty mold to be filled by any reader. And the general intention is aspiration, some kind of vague, undefined idealism, the desire to escape from the commonplace and to find, quote, something better in life. Life is a capital L, but all of that never given any content. Now, a young person would recognize the intention and would feel in his own concrete if he's not too rational a reader. In a sense, if he does not hold the writer responsible for conveying his own meaning, but is willing to provide the author's meaning and just take the author as a springboard. That, in fact, is the nature of his appeal.
Also has an enormous sense of his own potentialities and an enormous certainty of his own eventual achievement, particularly in Look Home with Angel.
You mean in that sense of aspiring to something great?
Yes, but I mean, he also says, you know, I know things that nobody around me knows, and my immediate problem is to get away to where I can do it, and I will do it. And he does it. So
but he doesn't do it. He never defines what is it that he's looking for.
No,
he constantly keeps going through life always, in effect, on the premise, I will expose myself to life. I want to see all of it. It will do something to me.
Well, what I meant is, well, I haven't read The Home with Angels since I was 17. But at the time, when I meant he does it, I merely mean is that he gets away from the small town and goes to the city, and he gets on the train with the absolute certainty that he's going to be a great man, and here he is printed in books and read in literature, of course.
Oh,
so
in
it
that
has
sense.
the feeling that, you know...
You assume then, stepping outside the covers of the book, to the man himself, that yes, he did achieve it.
Yeah.
But do you see that that's looking at it in two dimensions?
But it's very easy to do, particularly when it's one of the first things you read.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. As you remember your impression at 17, I guess that you liked it. Wasn't it precisely for the reason I named?
Yes, I think it was.
That it conveyed kind of a generalized abstraction of the aspiration of youth towards achievement and the future and something important to do. But there's no concrete ever given. And he never finds the meaning of life. He never even defines what he's looking for, except experience with a capital E.
For many young people, just the concrete of it getting on that train is kind of important.
That I can well believe. Now, I tried to find some naturalistic descriptions for you, as you suggested, and really, I couldn't. Not from such books as I have, there's just nothing worth showing. So that if you want to compare by yourself, I would suggest that you take, since we had read Arrowsmith, take in the very first chapter the description of the doctor's office where Arrowsmith works. I didn't want to go to the bother of copying the whole 2 pages because it's kind of a mixture of there's some description, then there is biographical narratives, and he goes back to describing the office. And if you want to observe what naturalistic description does, you will see particularly the description of his sink, some kind of wash bowl, and a shelf above it, and everything that's on that shelf. And he has a catalog there, if I remember rightly, an old toothpaste tube, and soap, and a leaf from a shore, a broken heel or something like that. It's a catalog that gives you a very clear description if you were a moving man and had to pack those things, but it does not gel at all into an overall impression of what kind of place it was. I didn't want to bother copying it since that book was our assignment anyway, so if you still have your copy of it, read it and observe for yourself what is the essence of the naturalistic description, which is cataloging. Now, I looked through Arrowsmith, I looked through Dodsworth. There are many small passages, too small to be of great value, but it will always, I notice, be the description of some concrete, differing from the concretes we were dealing with here, precisely in the fact that they're not essential. It'll be the opposite of what was very eloquent in Spillane's description, for instance. Well, he gives you such concretes as the ovals of faces, the hissing car, and the flickering cigarette butts. Now, you see, they do create the essential picture of a cold, foggy night. But in Dodsworth, for instance, there's a description of Dodsworth's impression of an English train as opposed to an American train. And what does Lewis describe? The embroidery on the loops that were hanging by the door, apparently to help the travelers, like subway loops. What do you call those things? Arm holders or something like that. Straps, or some special term, and that they were made of rough linen, which was embroidered and rough to the touch, but with a smooth leather inside. And that on the walls there were pictures of scenery, which one wouldn't see in American trains. That's the description. Now, you see the method. Now, they're concrete, they're observant, they're the kind that the traveler would come home and tell his friends, isn't it odd? It is not an artistic description of the style or essence of a British train compartment. So that I don't think it's worth wasting time on those beyond the general identification of what they usually do, which does not mean that a good naturalist writer may not sometimes have a very good description. Tolstoy has, who is my arch devil as far as literature goes. I think he's my exact opposite because he's the archetype of a naturalist. But he's a very good naturalist. In that style, he's done the best with it. Now, he very often has very eloquent descriptions, and you will observe this. To the extent to which they're good, they're done on the romantic method. That is, they're done by means of carefully selected, well-observed concretes that capture the essentials of a scene. Now, you don't want me to do more research on the naturalist literature. Are you clear? At least on the essence. I think we have not studied any of them in great detail. All that we can do is just to establish the essential differences between the two methods and the various methods by which one can describe. Now, this will conclude the quotations. Next time, I will conclude on style, and I'm not sure whether we'll have the time to finish all together, and if not, we'll take one more Saturday on the remaining subjects, such as the questions that Vivian brought up the question of specialized types of literature, for instance, such as fantasy, satire, comedy, or any specialized types. Now, what I would like to suggest is by next Saturday, if you have any questions of a general aesthetic literary nature, we just submit them to me in writing. I mean, make a list of the kind of things you want discussed, and we'll then probably discuss them next Saturday if we have time, more likely the Saturday after that, and then that will conclude the theoretical part.